Welcome to Break's webinar called Providing Care During the Shock Period, an overview of best practice early interventions to help people suddenly bereaved, sponsored by HCC. During today's webinar, academics and practitioners will explore and give best practice advice about what should and should not be undertaken by support workers. The focus will be on the critical first months of support for people bereaved by a sudden death, to give these vulnerable people the best chance of avoiding long-term medical conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder. A reminder that Break provides support to anyone bereaved or seriously injured in a road crash through its National Road Victim Service, and you can find out more information by visiting break.org.uk. Break also provides support for anyone suddenly bereaved through its Sudden service, and you can find more information at sudden.org. Throughout today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions in writing through our chat function. All speakers will be attending the live Q&A session at the end of this webinar to respond to your questions. Thank you again to our sponsors, HCC, and to all of you for registering today.
Making sense of traumatic bereavement, a trauma-informed approach to support. Bereavements which are sudden and unexpected may be regarded as traumatic bereavement, a term which actually indicates the interface between trauma and loss, where in such circumstances grief symptoms are overlaid with trauma symptoms. In fact, because the impact of sudden and traumatic loss is so devastating, it may result in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, meaning that the bereaved are faced with the dual task not only of mourning the loss, as well as coping with the trauma that accompanied the death. In addition, there is a growing recognition that the processes which occur after a bereavement may also leave the bereaved family susceptible not just to the effects of primary grief, but may also serve to exacerbate their distress, as they're required to navigate a myriad of medical, legal and criminal processes, which may prioritise organisational procedures and requirements over the needs and wishes of the bereaved family. Supporting bereaved families to navigate such processes and increasing their sense of voice and capacity to actively participate is absolutely essential. And in order to do this, we adopt what's called a trauma-informed approach to bereavement care, which provides us with a clear framework to provide support to bereaved families in the aftermath of a traumatic loss. A trauma-informed approach is one which recognises the widespread impact of trauma and stress and the potential for re-traumatisation, and that it actively seeks to reduce this possibility by understanding what's needed to foster resilience and coping, and by promoting opportunities for recovery. In addition to a trauma-informed approach, the SENSE model is used to structure the support which is provided by the sudden caseworkers in the immediate aftermath of a sudden and unexpected death. The SENSE model was first developed in response to the Manchester bombing in 2017 as part of my work with the Ministry of Justice funded project providing support to victims of terror. It was actually originally intended as a way of managing the large number of requests which were received by the organisation from children, young people, adults and families in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And perhaps more importantly, as a way of reducing the sense of overwhelm amongst professionals and those who were supporting them, providing them with a structure to their response. Since then, the SENSE model has been adapted to be used across a range of different contexts, including overseas terrorist incidents in hostile environments, such as Libya and Afghanistan, with hostages, and also specialist support organisations, such as Rape Crisis, and now with traumatic bereavement services as well. So making sense of traumatic bereavement is comprised of 5 key stages, which are around stabilisation, education, normalisation, social support and engagement. These 5 stages are actually derived from the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice, and the SENSE model was devised using recommendations of best practice by both the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence and also the broader trauma literature. In creating the word SENSE, the order of the letters in turn actually reflect the chronology in which the intervention should be offered. For example, as part of an early intervention approach, the emphasis is on stabilisation to ensure that physical and emotional safety of the person who's affected, making sure that their immediate needs are met. This is then followed by providing information and education about the signs and symptoms of trauma and promoting an understanding of how trauma may affect an individual in an attempt to normalise or validate these experiences and offer reassurance. It's this normalisation of symptoms coupled with education which then introduces the idea of empowering the individual and their wider social support network to monitor their symptoms and, where necessary, to facilitate an early referral to more formal psychological support services. The importance of social support in both reducing the impact of stressful life events and in protecting those affected from going on to develop PTSD and indeed other mental health difficulties is well established in the literature, suggesting that this is really essential in order to assess the presence and availability of social support as the fourth stage of the intervention. And the final stage is engagement. So this is about either encouraging engagement with specialist support services, promoting an individual's engagement with wider social supports, or assisting them to re-engage with their own values and goals and regain a sense of purpose and control. So as I said, the SENSE model is underpinned by the 6 guiding principles of trauma-informed practice, which include safety, so ensuring a sense of physical and emotional safety, choice, restoring a sense of choice and control, facilitating connections, supporting coping, responding to identity and context, and building strengths. I'm going to run through each of these principles in a little bit more detail to provide some context to the model and how each of the stages of the model are underpinned by these principles. So safety, as I said, this is around physical and emotional safety. But if we focus primarily on creating emotional safety, we see this being created by drawing on those key components of our effective communication skills, such as being patient, non-judgmental, kind, consistent, honest, understanding, listening actively, and bearing witness to distress. Perhaps most challenging in the context of traumatic loss in particular is that ability to bear witness to distress, and in doing so to manage our own sense of helplessness and overwhelm when we're faced with the pain and distress of those that we're working with. Actually, simply remaining present and engaged during these times can often be the hardest thing to do, but is also often the thing that's most needed. The second principle is about choice and restoring a sense of choice and control. And it's about the importance of trying to give people as much choice and control as possible. Often when someone has experienced a trauma, and particularly a traumatic bereavement, their sense of control has been significantly diminished and many of their choices have been taken away from them. So it's essential that we think about working in collaboration or partnership with the person that we're supporting. We're not doing things for or to them, but with them. And it's really important to continue to promote their active engagement and participation in the recovery process. Our next principle is around facilitating connections. It's about taking the time to understand a person's networks of support and encouraging them to connect with them. It's also about developing a relationship which is based on reciprocity and trust to ensure that our involvement and support is both effective and is what's most needed by those that we're working with. Our fourth principle is around supporting coping. When dealing with trauma, it's really important to remember that there's no right or wrong way of coping. Everybody's experience is completely different and unique, and our role is not to judge how someone is coping, but to meet them where they're at and not where we think they ought to be, and support them to cope. And this involves working within the person's level of tolerance and respecting their boundaries, but perhaps most importantly, prioritising their needs over what we feel we need to do or what we want to be doing for them. The fifth principle is about responding to identity and context. So thinking about who we're working with in terms of their gender, their background and family, their religious beliefs, their political affiliations, and also their circumstances. This is about not making assumptions about what this might mean, and instead taking the time to explore with people how they're making sense of their experience of both the trauma and the loss and the world around them. Finally, the sixth principle is around building strengths. Here we're reminded of people's innate resilience and strength, of their ability to demonstrate courage and determination in some of the most challenging and painful of circumstances. And so remembering and focusing on this as someone's capacity to cope and recognising and acknowledging their enduring strength becomes an essential part of our trauma-informed approach. So thinking about using the SENSE model to structure trauma-informed bereavement care, one of the advantages of the SENSE model is that it offers an early intervention approach which provides support to individuals and their families in the immediate aftermath of a sudden and unexpected loss. It's underpinned by those principles of trauma-informed practice, which very much focus on supporting coping, the identification of support needs, and promoting access to relevant long-term care. It's about providing a framework for some immediate stabilisation by identifying and addressing practical and emotional needs. And it's also about creating a framework in which to establish and manage support in the delivery of a time-limited intervention. I'm going to talk through each of the 5 stages of the SENSE model in a little bit more detail just to finish today. So stage 1 is all around stabilisation, and this is about addressing practical and immediate emotional needs. So asking some of those very basic questions right at the beginning around what do you need, what would be helpful to you at the current time. What we find is that when people have experienced a traumatic bereavement, they might find it really difficult to identify what they need and what would be most helpful. And so when someone doesn't know how to articulate their needs, offering them choices and options can be really important. Even if someone isn't sure what they need, they're often able to tell you what they don't need. And remembering it's not just about the focus on their emotional support needs, they're likely to have a number of practical support needs as well, particularly in this early intervention approach that we're adopting. Our next stage is all around education, and this is about helping people to really understand and recognise how they feel. And this is linked to our 3rd stage, normalisation, which is where we use this information and this understanding to provide reassurance that responses to the sudden and unexpected loss are very normal and to be expected. What we're looking to do in combining these 2 stages together, this education and normalisation, is about providing a safe and non-judgmental space for someone to discuss how they're feeling, reassuring them that there's no right or wrong way of coping, and our role as caseworkers is to support and enhance however they're coping, and remembering that ultimately they're coping in the best way they know how. And our starting point is trying to understand someone's way of coping, asking how is this helpful to them. And it's really only after developing a relationship with someone that we might be able to start to explore alternative coping strategies in a safe and supportive way. Our 4th stage links to that key principle around facilitating connections as one of our trauma-informed practice principles, and this is around social support. So facilitating connections with family, friends and wider support networks. And here interventions are around focused on identifying sources of support. This can include anything from people, places, animals and activities. What we're looking for is anything that the client might identify that supports them to cope, and then considering how access to this type of support can be strengthened and enhanced. When we're thinking about identifying sources of social support, what we're looking to do is to identify who or what is a positive source of support. As I said, this can include family, friends, professionals, other members of the community, as well as people, places, animals and activities. We want to be curious about how and why they're supportive. What do they offer to people which is helpful? And we also need to be thinking about how best this support can be accessed. And this is never so more important than it is at the moment in the context of a global pandemic, where many of the things that would normally support us to cope have been taken away from us, and we're faced with daily restrictions on our social contact in particular. And the final 5th stage is all around engagement. And this is focused on promoting a person's engagement with sources of support and activities that they find meaningful and beneficial. And this includes both formal and informal support, such as things like psychology and psychiatry services, mental health services, as well as thinking about other activities like yoga, meditation, sports, arts or crafts in recognition of their therapeutic effect and the ways in which such activities may support coping and increase a person's access to sources of social support within their wider communities. Our 5th stage as well, this engagement stage, is all about working in collaboration, to explore someone's needs and interests and considering whether or not we need to think about involving their wider support network in this engagement stage. What our caseworkers do is to create a personalised support plan, which is comprised of information about resources and services which are relevant and appropriate to the person that they're working with. There's actually often a wide range of local and national services which provide different types of support in the aftermath of a sudden bereavement, but they can be extremely difficult to navigate, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a loss, when people who are affected may feel very easily overwhelmed and confused by the services that are available to them. And so a personalised support plan can be a really useful way to promote access and engagement, and also to reduce this sense of overwhelm and confusion, and it often helps us to structure this support and allows for a person-centred and collaborative approach with opportunities to regularly review their needs. Thank you for listening.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my presentation regarding legal advice following fatal collisions. My name is Joe Speed. I am a partner at HCC Solicitors and I head up our Birmingham office. I specialise in serious, catastrophic and fatal collisions, predominantly arising from road traffic collisions, but also many other types of claim, including workplace incidents, occupier liability claims, and cases involving criminal injuries. This short presentation sets out some information of note in relation to fatal collisions, and my contact details are at the end, so please do get in touch if you have any queries. So the starting point is there a claim? To answer this, it is necessary to establish that the death has arisen from a wrongful act, neglect, or through default. With road traffic collisions, we are really talking about a wrongful act or negligence on behalf of another person or party. But even with road traffic collisions, it is not always straightforward. Sometimes it will be obvious, such as a head-on collision where the other vehicle has crossed onto the wrong side of the road. Sometimes it is not so obvious, such as escaped cattle on the road or a spillage on the road surface that results in a vulnerable road user, such as a motorcyclist, coming off. And sometimes it is not always one party at fault. There may be several parties who were at fault, in which case they all need to be identified and pursued accordingly. It may also be the case that the deceased was partly at fault. This is known as contributory negligence. In simple terms, a 50-50 split on fault would result in 50% of the claim being pursued. But the occurrence of the event itself does not necessarily mean negligence or fault will always follow. In the escaped cattle example, there may be a number of questions. Had the responsible person, most likely a farmer, taken all reasonable steps to safeguard the cattle? Was there a history of cattle escaping? Was the field suitable to house cattle with appropriate barriers in place? And was the response from all concerned timely and appropriate? It can take time and extensive investigations to find the answers. Sometimes many lines of inquiry need to be pursued and lots of evidence may need to be collated. It can be hard to second guess what has happened, even when, on the face of it, it seems obvious. An example might help demonstrate this. Say a passenger dies following a road traffic collision. Usually this would be regarded as a straightforward case on liability, as a passenger generally cannot do anything wrong to contribute to the collision. But what if it's a single vehicle road traffic collision and the driver wasn't speeding, wasn't distracted, and had properly maintained their vehicle? and the loss of control actually occurred due to a slow puncture which no reasonable driver could have anticipated. Does negligence follow? Every case ultimately turns on its own facts, and getting advice from a solicitor who specialises in fatal accidents, and preferably at an early stage, can be crucial. It will allow early consideration of all the issues and evidence planning, as well as adapting the investigation as matters progress and more information comes to light. But not every claim will be successful. So managing expectations from the outset can be very important to avoid giving false hope, especially during a time when the family members are likely to be experiencing the most difficult time of their lives. This slide contains a list of people that can bring a claim following a fatal collision. They are known as dependents. The categories are set out within the legislation that covers fatal collisions. It is really important to identify all such dependents, but this is not always straightforward and obvious, where the family dynamic may be complex. Having a solicitor that specialises in this area involved early on can help prevent difficulties that may otherwise occur in terms of identifying the rightful persons to be party to the claim. This slide gives an overview of what can be claimed. Firstly, there will be an award for pain and suffering. However, the award here is very low. In cases where there is immediate unconsciousness or almost immediate unconsciousness and death occurs within 1 week, the award will start at less than £1,300 and goes up to about £2,600. Even where that 1 week period is increased up to 6 weeks, the maximum award will only increase up to just £4,120. Other claims may include financial losses suffered between the collision and death, where death does not occur immediately, such as loss of earnings, medical expenses, care costs, and other reasonable expenses. There might also be a bereavement award, which as from 1st May 2020 is set at £15,120, but this is only available to spouses, civil partners, parents where the deceased was under 18 years old, and since 6 October 2020 it also includes cohabitees, including same-sex partners, which reflects the changing nature of our world, although legislation changes can be very slow to take effect. There might also be a claim for funeral expenses where such costs have been incurred by the dependents, and then also a dependency claim which can be based on loss of income, loss of pension, loss of related benefits, as well as loss of contribution to the family and household, such as property maintenance, domestic duties, and childcare. Dependency claims are often the largest and most complex element to investigate and quantify, and specialist legal advice could make a significant difference to the sum claimed. There will also only be one claim to be shared between all dependents, so it's important that all dependents are identified and included. A claim following a fatal collision is subject to a time period. The usual position in England and Wales is that the claim must be settled within 3 years, or, where that isn't possible, formal court proceedings must be commenced to stop the limitation period from expiring. If this period is missed, the right to pursue the claim would likely be lost. Certain cases have different time limits too, so understanding these can be crucial. For example, a child under 18 years old who brings a claim having lost a parent may have longer to do so, but a parent who loses a child under 18 would still be subject to the 3-year period. My advice is always to try and bring claims at the first opportunity, as evidence can fade with time, witnesses may move away or not be so cooperative. However, it is very important to bear in mind that these are generally the most emotionally difficult cases to bring, and different families will grieve and approach things in different ways. This slide touches upon inquests. Where a person dies unexpectedly, a coroner should be notified and an inquest may follow.
Now it's gone quiet.
Inquests can be very important in finding answers for the bereaved family members and obtaining evidence in the claim. The solicitor should be involved well in advance to ensure that all relevant matters are taken into account. For example, ensuring all relevant evidence is within the inquest bundle and that all appropriate witnesses are called. As for funding the involvement of a solicitor, this is typically done by way of a conditional fee agreement, which is most commonly known as a no-win, no-fee agreement. Where the claim succeeds, costs will then be sought from the insurer for the person or party that has been negligent and caused the collision. So this means that costs are deferred until the case concludes and hopefully allows the solicitor to support the dependents in the right way without adding to the financial pressure. This last slide contains my contact details. You are all very welcome to get in touch should you wish to, and I thank you very much for listening.
Hello, I'm Dr. Rachel Gibbons. So I'm here, I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I've been working on suicide in particular over the last 12 years. And I'm going to talk to you about the effect of a sudden bereavement, a sudden shocking bereavement, and what is helpful and what isn't. So what's the problem? What sort of problems particularly does a sudden bereavement provide us with to think about? What helps and what's helpful to think about in the aftermath, and what might hinder there. So this is a picture really of an image of the experience that I've had personally, or I've seen, witnessed a sort of visual representation of the experience of being in a tsunami after a sudden bereavement, as though you're suddenly, functioning in your daily life and then you're submerged in a wave and you don't know whether you're going to survive or not survive. So I've been thinking particularly about suicide, and just to talk a little bit about that before going on in more general terms. I mean, suicide is a very shocking bereavement that in nearly all cases people talk about it coming out of the blue. So even if someone has been unwell or expressing suicidal thoughts at the time they die, people aren't expecting them to die. Very rarely is it an expected event, and I think there's something about it, the very nature of it also, that makes it incomprehensible before you come up against it. But having said that, now suicide is a relatively rare event. I mean, it's about 10 per 100,000 of the population. However, in your lifetime, you're likely 22% lifetime prevalence to lose a family member or a close friend to suicide. That what we understand about it now is that actually there's been very little support provided for those that are bereaved in this way. And I think this might be true of traumatic bereavement in many cases, but certainly with suicide we know this is the case, that very little support has been provided, and 1 in 4 have no support, but there haven't been any sort of services provided for those bereaved. And actually, there was a complaint that family members would make, and is that if they'd lost a family member to murder, they'd get victim support, but actually if it was death by suicide, there was no support provided for them, and they'd be left in this abyss, this sort of empty space after the death, in total shock, not knowing how to move forward at all. That to have a sudden bereavement by suicide increases the risk of suicide in those bereaved, that there's an increase in other adverse outcomes, dropping out of studying and work, for example, very high levels of stigma, shame and mental health problems that also put a barrier into getting support, that this also becomes an intergenerational trauma, an intergenerational event. So whatever we might try and look at about the immediate effects of it, that this is something that the effects are only seen over generations. And what we have come to or thinking about is that this is very important how we intervene. You know, that poor outcomes are related to the response afterwards. So to sort of put suicide in particular over to one side and to think a bit about trauma. Now, if you haven't read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, I'd recommend it very highly, by Bessel van der Kolk. So this is really, I mean, what he's really writing about is the role of the body in trauma. And what he's saying is that trauma, sudden bereavement and trauma, but sudden bereavement is a trauma, affects the whole body, but it doesn't just affect it, it actually changes it. So the actual effect, the physiological effect of trauma changes your mind and body structurally. And that traumas get held in the somatic system, that actually traumas are held in the body without words. And he describes the nature, the background for this, the physiological background, is that when you're in a traumatic experience, the part of your mind that's more mature and thoughtful shuts down, leaving the more primitive side of the mind to cope with this trauma. Now, this more primitive side of the mind is very hormonally related, but it also doesn't have words. It's not linguistically, it doesn't manage things linguistically, but manages things in a body way through a physiological emotional response, so that these traumas get stored in the body without words, so have no words there. So this is the case after a sort of sudden bereavement as well, that this is a physiological response and your mind shuts down. In a psychological way of thinking about it, you lose your capacity to think in any symbolic way, and this can last for a long period of time. So there is no way we can expect people who've been recently bereaved to be able to communicate in a way that would otherwise we might expect, to communicate or sort of think with us in a therapeutic way, in a way we might otherwise expect. So that trauma actually gets stored in the body without words. So I think we need to just sort of think if that's the case, then what's the best, most supportive way to help? What we see in deaths of this nature, and particularly with those bereaved by suicide, is that initially someone is very shocked, because these sudden bereavements come totally in a place where you're not expecting them, in a traumatic way suddenly. So you're initially very shocked, but you can't, and you're thrown into a place of confusion and uncertainty. You don't really know what's happened, why it's happened. And as human beings, we're very narratively focused. So we deal with things in a narrative way. We make narratives and stories up as a way of managing our anxiety and our uncertainty. So what you see very quickly, and I think I've seen it within 20 minutes happened, someone going from being absolutely shocked and not expecting something to within 20 minutes constructing a narrative about what's happened. And this story about what has happened and why gets constructed very quickly, gets held sometimes with a delusional level of certainty, a very high level, very sort of unshakable. And they tend to cast themselves, the person who's subject to the trauma, tend to cast themselves as a major player in this narrative. So they may feel very obsessed with, I've made a mistake, I'm to blame, that somehow I'm guilty for this having happened, feeling shame and humiliation, even though to someone who's standing outside this situation, this would not seem in any way possible. The person themselves can feel extremely guilty, shame, humiliation, and to blame. And they might find themselves going over and over events in their mind. If I'd only done this differently, it's my fault. If I'd have said this, if I'd have done that. And there's usually one thing in particular that in the early stages that I got focused on, that somehow if they'd have done something differently, that someone would not have been lost in this way. And these are relatively early stages, and it's an important transitional point, because if someone is feeling guilty and ashamed and feeling overly responsible, the way they might respond to that is to withdraw and to hide, because they feel other people will be looking at them and thinking this as well. So this is a very important point of intervention, and if it can be sensitively responded to, and someone can feel in a receptive space, non-judgmental space, and they're able to talk about these feelings, then it can mean that this can be moved through and there can be gradually more realistic development. But a problem comes is if they're not given some help, support, at this point, they can get very stuck and entrenched in these feelings. So very difficult to move on from. So that's a bit about actually what happens physiologically in a trauma. So it gets stored without words, and this about the narrative that can get constructed with the person who has actually lost someone in a traumatic way, feeling that they're to blame, and this sort of feeling also compounding their loss. So just thinking then about what support is helpful, what support might be helpful if this is the case. If the trauma is held in the body without words, then trying to rush in with words and trying to get someone to put something into words initially isn't going to work, and may not be helpful at all. So this sort of, it's not too soon for intervention, but it's too soon for pressure to talk, for pressure to sort of, for therapy, if you like, can make something worse. What's needed is space and time, and the families who've been bereaved by suicide have talked about this, space and time, but what's wanted is intervention that is proactive, comes and finds them, comes to try and communicate with them, because they can't necessarily put their mind together to even work out what's going on. So you need proactive support and accompanying. And this was the word that seemed to come up in the focus groups that we had, was what they want, some accompanying through the process. So some way, someone who will support and go alongside, be there when you want to talk about something. And it might be that what you want to talk about is the things you have to do. You know, what do I have to do? The sort of general tasks that need to be carried out after a death in this way. So someone to accompany, benign, caring, if you like, compassionate, accompanying through the process. And this is also backed up by Alexandra Pittman. So Alexandra Pittman's done a lot of work in this area. And what she's talked about is what's needed, and what families and people bereaved in this way say that they want, is others to recognise, understand and to respond. So it's not to turn away, it's not to feel too uncomfortable to talk about it. It is for others to acknowledge the loss. And I think this is what people say is incredibly painful, is that in the early stages people might talk about your lost loved one, but this can fade very quickly, and particularly something about suicide where people feel uncomfortable and there's a sense of shame and stigma around it. People can turn away from talking about the loss, and then they feel very abandoned and alone. That actually them hiding their grief, it conceals extensive need for support, and again needs proactive intervention. Better training for professionals and the lay public, so as we're doing now. Repeated offers of support are needed, because someone might not feel ready early on. So it's to be able to cope, I think, also with being pushed away a bit by those bereaved, but not to be put off by that, but also not to be too intrusive, but to be there and to be proactive. And some also awareness that it's not just about relatives, that there is a whole network around someone who is bereaved, that where support is needed. So to keep open eyes to who's in the network and who might be helped or might need something. So I think in summary, when someone is bereaved in this way, there's something about the main key things are to think about keeping them in mind, trying to contact them, finding out what it is they feel ready for, to keep in mind that this trauma is held in their body, so they do not have words for it necessarily. And sometimes people might communicate in quite difficult, emotional ways, and to not be put off by that, to be sensitive to intrusion, but to not feel rejected and to back off. And accompanying, I think the main area to think about is accompanying, allowing compassionate space to see what someone's needs are and to respond to them. Thank you. Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies, we've been experiencing some technical difficulties with the audio. We'll now have time for our question and answer session. I just wanted to give a big thank you today to today's speakers for attending and for delivering their presentations, and sponsors, HCC Solicitors. I'm pleased to say we're joined today by Joe Speed and Rachel Gibbons. Unfortunately, Nicola Lester could not end this question and answer session. Please remember questions to us via the chat function or the question screen. To be read out shortly by Katie Shepherd, but it's probably best to commence now with the Q&A session. First of all, a quick question I suppose I'm best placed to answer. Will the slides in this presentation be made available to everybody? Yes, they will be. They'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel after the webinar is completed, possibly in a few days' time. Katie, hello, can you hear us?
Yes, back online, and apologies all. So the first question from me goes to Joe. Where should we signpost bereaved families to learn more about making a claim?
Can you hear me okay? Because I've had audio problems this end.
Yes, we've got you clear. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. I think it's a good question. I think the Break website has a number of firms who specialise in this area, including my own. So that's a good starting point. And I think all the firms on there and others around the country would hopefully offer an initial free consultation to speak to the families. And in normal non-COVID times, we would go out and see them wherever they are at a time that's convenient for them and chat through with them. And certainly from my point of view, it's always with zero obligation to proceed. And you can actively encourage people to speak to more than one solicitor, because it can be quite a difficult journey, and I think it's all about finding the right fit for them as well. So having a solicitor who knows what they're doing but also fits that particular family is quite important, in my opinion. And so often you might have people meet with 2 or 3 and then try and choose from there, but I think the Break website is probably the best starting point.
Thank you for that, Joe. So for anyone who's unaware, the Break website is www.break.org.uk, and there's a wealth of information both for victims of road crashes but also for professionals supporting them. People may also find it useful to visit sudden.org, which caters for anybody supporting somebody suddenly bereaved. So Rachel, if we could come across to you next, what are some of the particular sensitivities FLOs need to be aware of in suicide cases?
I don't know whether I was thinking particular sensitivities. I think everybody's different, and it's being, I think it will depend very much on your relationship with someone before the death, really, with the person who's died, but also the families or the relatives. It depends what your relationship is. And how well you've got to know them. I think there's something, certainly within mental health, what we talk about is not being too intrusive. It's ensuring that there is support for families and that people reach out and communicate, but there's something about how to balance one's own needs, because you might feel very bereft and traumatized, as well as the relatives, and how not to respond to your own grief and loss. So, for example, trying to phone too much or trying to make too much contact yourself. Remember, when you're working in a service environment, that you're part of a system and a team, and be thoughtful, talk to your team, talk to other people around you about the best way to intervene and who it should be that offers support, really, in that sort of situation.
Of course, thank you. And Joe, if we could come back across to you, what is your advice for managing expectations regarding a claim?
Absolutely. I think at the outset, I would always approach it with some caution. On the face of it, it's when you initially get an inquiry or you find out the details, you don't always find out enough to make a really informed decision. I had a non-fatal collision come to me very recently where the information I got suggested it was going to be as open and shut as it could get, and that's the only information I had when I spoke to that particular family. And when I dug a little bit deeper with external sources, it's now turned out to be quite a complex case. So I was pleased that I managed their expectations at the outset until you know enough about it to really give them some definitive advice. I think my experience of dealing with bereaved families is they've got so much on their plate and so many emotions already running high that it can be quite difficult to focus on what I'm necessarily telling them straight away. So I talk to them about, what my role is and what we try to do and the journey we go on with them. And I then try to reassure them that I will carry out all the investigations and try and collate all the evidence to then have a proper discussion with them and give them my advice. Hopefully, if I'm speaking to them in very early on, hopefully at a time when they've moved forward with the grieving process as well. But I think, it's even when it seems really obvious, I think it's about letting the process get established and letting them know what I'm doing at every stage. And then hopefully, if any problems do arise during that journey, I may have preempted it anyway, but they will be kept informed as that happens. And then it's about finding the approach for every different family and client you speak with. I act for many different people in many different situations, and my approach has to vary according to who's on the other end of my advice. So hopefully that helps.
It does, thank you. And I think it probably demonstrates the holistic nature of the support that you're able to provide as well.
Sure.
So we have quite a general question now. We're wanting advice about any good resources or books that are specific to the topic of sudden bereavement. So Rachel, perhaps I could come to you first on this point.
Yeah, I think the main one that comes to mind for particularly suicide is Help Is at Hand. It's an absolutely superb, really, really good resource developed by the Oxford Centre for Suicide Research for those that are bereaved by suicide, and it has in there some basic guidance through what you might feel and what your needs might be, but then also very good list of resources, websites, other support services where you can get particular bereavement support. So SOBS groups, your local SOB group, which is groups, sort of a peer group for those that are bereaved by suicide. Very, very helpful there. So the booklet is Help Is at Hand, which gives you all those different resources, but SOBS groups, local SOBS groups, to actually go and attend in person and meet with other people who are going through or have been through similar experiences is very, very helpful.
Lovely, thank you. And is there anything that you'd like to add to that, Joe? I
think, again, I would generally point people to the Break website, where they've got a tab on there, a help and support section, and it sort of takes you through to various other sources depending on the circumstances. That tends to be my starting point. We do work with people, and again, it's sort of on a case-by-case basis, depending on the exact nature and what's involved. But we do try and try and direct people to people we've worked with in the past and who we think are a good fit for that particular family. But again, it's the BREAK website that I tend to send them to.
Perfect, thank you. And just for the benefit of those who have dialed into the webinar, we have both on the BREAK website and the Sudden website a range of resources, both for support professionals, for individuals bereaved, and also for children, so for younger children, to help them deal with their emotion and to enable parents to be able to talk to children about their sudden bereavement, whether that's caused by car crash or suicide or any other means of bereavement. So I think on the slide in front of you can see the websites now, and there are those resources available. Well, that's all the questions we've got. So before I wrap up for the day, I am truly honoured to be able to read a message of support from Nadine Dorries, who is our Minister for Bereavement. So Nadine says, as a Minister of Bereavement, I am acutely aware of the long-term effects a sudden or unexpected bereavement can have on individuals and families, particularly when appropriate support is not available during the critical early stages of grief. I would like to pass on my thanks to Sudden for hosting this free to access webinar, bringing together professionals, practitioners and academics to share their expert views on such an important topic. Effective early interventions are making a positive difference to the lives of many people when they are at their most vulnerable. So thank you to Nadine on behalf of BREAK for all of those kind and powerful words. So I'd like to wrap up today's webinar session by thanking our speakers again, and a huge thank you to our headline sponsor, HCC. Many thanks all for dialing in. Take care.
Thank you very much, everyone.